Hello and welcome to the IND podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Dunicic. Like, comment, and subscribe. Join our international community and join the discussion. Today we are going to discuss a form of cyber attacks known as DOS or DDoS attacks. Now, I am not a tech or cybersecurity expert. My knowledge of this is relatively layman, but I do understand it a little bit better than the average person. So if I do say something incorrect or whatever, feel free to call me out in the comments because I'm not a programmer, I'm not a hacker, and I'm not a cybersecurity expert. Nonetheless, I do have a relative knowledge of some relative cyber attacks that do occur regularly today. Because as an expert on international relations, it has become a common tool for nations, non-governmental organizations, and different political actors to carry out their ambitions and goals. Now, let's just cover what a denial of service attack is. Basically, the best way to understand this is an analogy. Now, imagine that you have a store, and that store has an entrance. Now, the entrance to that store, the door is bandwidth. Okay, that is bandwidth. And the amount of people entering and exiting the store or using its services are requests. Now, if there are too many requests going into a door of a supermarket or a store, regular, normal, everyday customers would not be able to go in because a door has a limited amount of people it can accept inside it. Now, that is exactly how a denial of service attack works. Basically, a host and a server provide a service. This can be a website for a bank, a government ministry, pretty much anything runs on limited bandwidth. Even very large companies will have extremely high amounts of bandwidth and be able to process multiple requests and different kinds of traffic that is going towards its website. However, the amount of requests that can be processed is not infinite. And this is what denial of service attacks utilize or exploit. Now, basically, a denial of service attack is taking a request and sending it to a host or a server's website and bombarding them with traffic. So much traffic that, going back to the analogy of the supermarket or the store, that other normal customers who are using a service or a website are not able to use it because the website will either be completely shut down or flooded with traffic and unable to properly process any requests. Now, there are typically two major forms of DOS attacks. One is a standard DOS attack. Now, the other one is a DDoS attack. What a DDoS attack is a distributed denial of service attack. Now, really fundamentally, the only difference here is the size and scope of the DOS attack that is occurring. Now, a normal DOS attack will typically have 1 to 3 different kinds of machines sending in requests to a host or server. Now, a distributed DOS attack is much more sophisticated, has much more resources, and has requests coming in from an innumerable amount of sources and machines. Now, typically, DDoS attacks are carried out by people that have major amounts of resources. There are multiple ways to carry out a DDoS attack, but the main limiting factor or determining factor really is resources, is the ability to have machines or computers or any kind of device that can send out these requests to the specific target of the attack. Now, for example, one common way of carrying out DDoS attacks is to simply use malware. So millions of people all across the world can download a specific file which may have malware inside it. This malware will get inside someone's electronic device, whether it's a laptop, computer, or a smartphone. And this malware, unbeknownst to the user that downloaded this, is now acting to send requests in DOS attacks. And that does happen. So be very careful of what you are downloading and make sure that you're downloading from a trusted source. If you are not downloading from a trusted source, do extensive research on who you're downloading from, what you're downloading, and how you're downloading it. And it's also a good sense of practice to constantly be checking your computer for different kinds of viruses, malware, etc. Because a lot of people all over the world have these kinds of malware on their computer. And while it is fundamentally harmless to their own device, it does assist in the carrying out of attacks, which have been utilized to cripple government functions, large businesses, etc. Now, why have DOS and DDoS attacks become so prevalent? Now, going back to a DDoS attack, when it comes to politics, really, or international relations, what is more common is a distributed denial of service attack because it's a larger scale. And typically the kinds of actors functioning in this field are other governments, political actors, or very well organized NGOs. Now, the only thing required really to take out a DDoS attack is resources. One, as I mentioned before, you can either have malware that's on the computers of uncountable amounts of people that are completely unbeknownst to it, or two, you can have your own amounts of large servers and machines that carry out the attack manually. There are a lot of options. Now, another facet of DDoS attacks, if they are more sophisticated, and this part is not that complicated, is that the IP address of the originating source of the attack is usually changed, which makes, for the host or the target of the attack, it makes it much harder for them to determine where this attack is coming from and to shut down the services from these specific traffic sources. Now, in a normal DOS attack, it is typically easy, and the best solution is to figure out the source of the traffic, the actor that is carrying it out, and just block them from making requests to the server. And that will save your bandwidth. But with the DDoS attack, one, the amount of requests being processed is significantly much higher. Two, the location or the IP address of these DDoS attacks is significantly harder to find, which means that it is nigh impossible to just block these users from making requests, because if you do, you're pretty much blocking everyone from making a request. And typically that is the only way to stop a DDoS attack, is just by shutting down the server. Now, this has become a lot more common in different political ambitions and goals being carried out. Why? One, it is extremely easy to carry out. It does not require a large amount of technical expertise. Obviously, someone has to understand what a DDoS attack is, how to carry it out, but it doesn't require the highest level of hacker or programming knowledge. It is a relevantly, actually, primitive kind of cyber attack that is basically just shooting requests and bombarding requests at different applications, websites, or different kinds of electronic machine networks to shut them down by flooding them. Think of it as a flood. That is what a DDoS attack is. Number two, DDoS attacks, when the IP addresses are manipulated, are extremely hard to track. Simply because of the large amount of different traffic coming all over the world, it's hard to pinpoint specifically where the DDoS attack came from. So plausible deniability after the attack is discovered is always there. It is essentially the perfect cyber crime. And that brings us to the final reason why these attacks have become so much more prevalent. The reality is while legislation does exist in countries like the United States, like the United Kingdom, and some European nations restricting DDoS attacks and pretty much qualifying them or categorizing them as a form of illegal cyber activity, in many other parts of the world, in fact, in most other parts of the world, DDoS attacks are not necessarily illegal, because the actual action, when you think about it, of a DOS or a DDoS attack is just what you and me do every single day. When I upload this video now on YouTube, I am making a request to the server and the bandwidth of YouTube. When you are watching this, as you are watching me talk to you right now on this video, you are making a request to the server of YouTube. So legally defining what is a DOS attack and what is just standard normal use of a server's services, or of a bandwidth services or a host services, is kind of a slippery slope. So legislation being introduced to stop DOS or DDoS attacks is kind of a legal minefield, if you will. And it has gone so far that even in the United States, where DOS or DDoS attacks are illegal, many people have pushed to make them legal and categorize them as a form of protest. Now, the reason why is it actually does kind of make sense. When you really think about it, a DOS or a DDoS attack is no different than a large protest. Now, I'm going to use the truckers in Canada as an example. Now, what the truckers in Canada did is they used their big rigs and different vehicles to block traffic from various different points of cities in Canada and also between the United States and Canadian border, essentially limiting trade. This was crippling for the United States and Canadian economy for a period of time until the protesters were taken care of. But all they were doing is making extensive amounts of false requests to go through a border or to go through a street. A DOS or a DDoS attack is no different. Really, the only difference is that it's in the digital world. So if one form of protest is perfectly legal, the other form should be too. But that is a legal minefield that I'm not going to get into. If you do want to have this discussion, we can have it in the comments, but I don't want to take this podcast off the rails just yet. But do let me know in the comments what you think about DOS attacks and DDoS attacks, why they are becoming more frequent and the legality of them. Now, the reason that I talk about these attacks today is because they are becoming significantly more prevalent. The most recent example is yesterday. The government of Ukraine and many large Ukrainian banks experienced major DDoS attacks to the point where they had to shut down services for an entire day. Now, this can be crippling to an economy and to the functions of the government. In addition to this, Ukraine right now, who is trying to maintain as much foreign investment as it can in its country, having DDoS attacks on major banking institutions looks really fucking bad for investors. And now, the reality of this is, this came at a day where Russia has stated that it's going to pull back its troops, simply because maybe troops are no longer necessary in this conflict. And maybe soldiers will not be necessary in conflicts from 10 to 15 years from now. Cyber attacks can be much more crippling, have much larger consequences, and force people's hands much more effectively than sending soldiers to shoot rifles or even sending drones to lob down missiles at specific targets. The future of warfare is cyber. And we should all have a fundamental basic understanding of the various cyber attacks that can occur. So I just wanted to cover one of the most common, if not the most common, form of carrying out cyber attacks, which is a denial of service attack. Again, comment. Let me know what you think about the situation with the DOS attacks that occurred in Ukraine. Let me know what you think about DOS attacks. If you have more extensive cybersecurity knowledge than myself, let me know how my report was. I'm genuinely curious. I think it was good, but if you have more knowledge than me, please let us know in the comments. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you guys tomorrow.